Morning and welcome back to the main session. This is our first panel session of the day. I'm Nick Mothershaw from the Open Identity Exchange. I'm going to be moderating this panel this morning. So welcome everyone. We're going to be talking about will banks take a lead in building the digital identity ecosystem on the panel this morning. So a number of questions that are there in the agenda to kick us off, but what we're hoping for is a lively debate amongst the panel about will they or won't they, and if not, who will. So let me introduce the panel. So I'll just ask you to give yourself a quick introduction. So we'll start with Rod Boothby, please.
Hi, I'm Rod Boothby. I'm the Global Head of Digital Identity at Santander.
Brilliant, thanks Rod. And Karen Cullen?
Hi Nick, my name is Karen Cullen and I am a Principal Officer in the Department of Finance in the Ministry of Finance in Dublin. I have a whole of government strategy that I assist the Minister of State in leading.
Brilliant, thanks Karen, welcome. And Bjorn Hjelm?
Hi, my name is Bjorn. I'm with the Verizon CTO office working on identity. I'm also the Vice Chairman of the Open ID Foundation.
Brilliant, thank you. And finally, Harsh Mohan.
Hey, hi. I'm the Global Principal with ING Group, looking into beyond banking business models for ING.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, welcome all. So we kick off this morning by just going around the panel with an initial question around, who's going to act as the guardians of digital identity. So who's going to pick up that role going forward? And there's a number of candidates in there, and we're talking about banks here today. But who, for each of you, who do you think is likely to end up as the guardians of our digital identities, the ones that we hold and hold dear to our chest? And we'll come on to that in a moment. But if I go around the panel again, just to kick this off, so Rod, who do you think is going to be the holders of identity as we go forward?
I think banks are going to play a key role in trying to solve that problem. Today, there's a huge fundamental problem in the internet that hasn't been solved. How do we establish trust? It's actually an extremely expensive problem. HSBC estimates that financial crime costs us annually $2 trillion a year globally. That's a huge portion of our total GDP. We all pay for it, kind of like a tax, in the form of spam, in the form of phishing, in the form of misinformation. We've been hit with misinformation that has global political impacts. In the form of natural trust monopolies, where one company comes to dominate a space and everything else gets distributed through them. That reduces our options. It reduces competitivity in the marketplace. So how do we solve for it today? Today, we trade our privacy for trust. You're always being asked, what's your mother's maiden name and your first dog and age and address and everything else about you to establish a new account online. What that does is it means that your private information, your behavior, is being picked up and copied and cloned all over the place. It exposes you to risk, and we see that all the time. We hear about major hackings on a weekly basis, things like the recent hacks of the Microsoft Outlook stuff, the huge hacks on the American government just last year. How do we solve this? Well, one way to solve it is to not give all your private information again and again to external entities. Instead, it's to use a trusted verifier, to have somebody that you trust, that society in general trusts, to vouch for you. And banks, I think, make a natural and obvious case. It's happened already in the Nordics with a thing called Bank ID. It's proven really successful there. Instead of logging in with your Facebook ID or logging in with your Google ID, you can log in with your bank ID. What we've been doing is creating something called the Open Digital Trust Initiative in partnership with the Open ID Foundation and the IIF to create something where we could actually solve this, where you could have a simple pattern where every time you want to log in, you can use your bank. Now, why banks? Because banks are in the business of protecting your privacy and not distributing your data. When you go to the supermarket to buy some health food, you don't suddenly find yourself inundated with health food ads because the bank doesn't share your information. It keeps it private. And it's a regulated entity that's trusted well enough to act as your verifier. So to answer your question, I think it's going to be banks.
Okay, thanks, Rod. Karen, what's your view? Ron used the term there, trusted verifier. Who do you think is likely to be a trusted verifier of our information going forward?
Well, in terms of which entities are best placed to act as guardians of the use of digital identity, I think the short answer to this question is both. From a policy perspective, and I say both, I mean both governments and tech companies. I think from a policy perspective, it's important that we focus on the people and their rights, as this issue relates to the use of their past personal data and the control they have over it, as Rod mentioned there just a moment ago. Just to say that in Ireland, we engaged intensively with the European Commission in the development of the EU digital finance strategy last year, and the issue of digital identity was central to that work. In the strategy, the Commission has a target of 2024 for a legal framework for interoperable digital identity solutions based on informed consumer consent and a more harmonised AML rules. And as part of our outreach that we did last year in developing our submission on the EU strategy, we had a series of dialogues with firms at home here in Ireland and across the UK, the EU and the US, particularly on the West Coast, where some of the panel are this morning. And it became very clear that a solution on digital identity will be required if the full potential of the EU single market of 460 million people is to be realised. In practice, at European level, that's going to involve bodies like the European Banking Authority and its sister authorities that look after insurance and capital markets to harmonise the rules on customer onboarding. And from our conversations with the big tech firms, they want to be part of that process by providing the digital plumbing, so to speak. But I don't see them having a direct role in the regulatory process at this stage.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So there's the number of other organisations other than banks there who could take a key role in this going forward, and it sounds like it may be a mixed role, and we'll come back to that later. Bjorn, from your perspective, who's poised to provide this service to each of us as an identity verifier or a digital identity provider?
I believe there will be an ecosystem where multiple players that will participate. So the ecosystem would include both banks, government, and mobile network operators. Part of the work that Verizon has spent in the OpenID Foundation is to enable standards to provide interoperability among these different players, and also the joint venture among the four major operators in the United States, referred to as Zenki, is also to contribute to this ecosystem. So I think you can see the work in the OpenID Foundation to be the tools of the facility among the players that make up this ecosystem, and they work in the Open Identity Exchange as the rules for how to govern some of that work. So in my view, there will be an ecosystem, and depending on what the use case is, there may be one other player that play a bigger role than others.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. So that brings a fourth group, the mobile network operators, in as kind of candidates. So Harsh, going to turn in lastly to you with this question. Who do you think is going to be an identity provider? And is it going to be one provider, or is it going to be multiple people, depending on use cases and geography, perhaps? So.
Yeah, so it's always tricky to comment on something in which three distinguished speakers have always already commented upon.
Yeah.
But let me add a bit of a different flavor to it. Um, Before answering your question, let us realize that this is not a one solution fits all market. Right? There would be different combinations of solutions in different geographies. So we should look at it from a right to play question. And in that context, you see that the first in that order are governments or bodies like EBA and other associations that were mentioned. Why I say that they have a first right to play is because they have a large capacity to create such an infrastructure using the government resource pool and make it available for all private parties to consume. So I would say that they have the first right to play, but this is not true for all markets. Different markets behave differently. Then I would say banks come next. They have also a fairly good right to play because they are trust custodians and they have a large amount of financially eligible traffic with them. The thing to note here is that when we talk of identity, we also talk about inclusion of non-banked population. So for any bank-led or private consortium-led ID to be successful, it would still need a bit of a government cooperation in that sense. Right. So the even with the banks consortium, we are looking at active encouragement. Rod mentioned about bank ID. If you look at one of the trigger success factors for them, it was that the tax filings, etc., were possible. So these combinations need encouragement. The third in line would be mass retail companies. For example, we can talk about telco, and again we see a combination of telcos plus banks. For example, in It's Me, where in Belgium, where It's Me is a solution. Um, then we also have the big elephant in the room, which is big techs. They have a low level of assurance, but they are still playing a decent role, and they are doing a one solution. Can it capture all markets kind of an approach? And it remains to be seen. But I see things in that order. And let me also add another important element to it, which is that whosoever controls this solution between these three or four different combinations, the local government or the country government needs to ensure that it is under their influence. Because when we talk of identity, it is not a payment thing that money gets transacted once and then there's a system of records to capture it. In identity, if it gets leaked, then it is harmful for the citizens. So if you talk about GDPR, privacy rights, etc., there needs to be a umbrella regulatory body to manage this. So that's why I said I'm adding another dimensions to it because three distinguished speakers have already given their answers to the question.
No, it's tricky, and I know, and I often get asked the same question in my role at OIX, and I usually present a set of Olympic rings with potentially different winners in it, and the fifth one I have is as yet unknown disruptor comes into the market with something that
Indeed.
is new and works for everybody, and he takes everything by storm, and they could also take the market. But I think I agree. It will depend on the market, and if we look at different geographies around the world, the solutions led by different parties. And it was an interesting point there that you said that whatever you're doing, you've got to almost have that government oversight for identity. I guess in the same way as you do for payments, payment infrastructures don't exist outside of governments. Well, some of them do. Some of the newer Bitcoin-based ones do, but traditional ones very much have a government-based set of rules around them as well, or just government overview. So we've got a number of different candidates there, from banks to tech providers who might take this role. Thinking about banks specifically, we've got open banking, and Rod, one of the questions you said that their banks are trusted, and that's one of the they feature high in mind trust in terms of using them for identity. But we also have open banking, which means that the data is shareable. Is this is this good from a digital identity point of view, or is it a challenge? How does open banking fit to help here? And Bjorn, perhaps if I could ask your views on that, because I know Open Identity Foundation has the FAPI API, which is all around open banking. How does that fit identity provision? Is open banking a help, or is it in?
I believe that the open banking was ahead of its time, and clearly the pandemic has emphasized the need for digital identity and the use of it. I think, again, the open banking paved the way for some of the similar movements among other parts of the world in terms of opening up the banking industry and the APIs. And the work within the financial grade API working group was heavily influenced by the work in the open banking to satisfy the needs that existed. I would also add that as a addition to the financial grade API specifications, there's also another initiative within the OpenID Foundation referred to as the OpenID Connect for Identity Assurance that defines a schema, an OpenID Connect schema for conveying verified attributes. And so as you try to establish a identity of a person, the specification attempts to have a way of having an OpenID provider validate or convey verified attributes in a schema where you can have unverified and verified attributes being responded to a RP as part of onboarding a user or verifying a user's identity. And again, that OP can be a bank, it can be a mobile network operator or a third party.
Okay, yeah.
I'd add to that part of the work that the foundation is doing is that we have a certification program. And I think that was also another important aspect that Open Banking Initiative identified, that there's a way of verifying that you have done your implementation correctly. So I'll add that part too.
Okay, so that's a specific technical profile, I guess, to share in terms of ID trust, in as opposed to general information sharing for for open banking's purpose. So ID Foundation's evolving to support what would this broader initiative around digital ID. That's good to hear. Rod and Harsh, from your perspective around from a bank, is that how you would see delivering trust? Is that vital to push trust out there from banks to?
It's a first step. It's the beginning of the process, and I agree with Bjorn that it was when it first came out, it was definitely ahead of its time, and people are only starting to realize and utilize the full value of it. I think we're at an early stage. The work that OpenID is doing to extend the capabilities of their system are also kind of at an early stage compared to, I think, the value that they're going to deliver. For folks who don't know OpenID, you use the OpenID standard and pattern today every time you log in with another site's ID. So if you log in with your Google ID or you log in with your Facebook ID, you're using the OpenID pattern. The problem is, that Facebook and Google are in the business of monetizing everything that you do online and turning you into the commodity. They want to advertise, they want to direct information toward you and help the people who really make them money, which is their advertisers. But that compromises your privacy. The challenge with this, as Harsh alluded to, is the huge structure of things that we have in terms of when governments, when other institutions can see what you're doing. And the great genius of open banking was that it pulled governments out of the loop so that individuals weren't completely transparent. We had a bit of privacy from our government, which was a good thing.
Cool. And Harsh, from your perspective, is this kind of delivery protocol something that you see as helping the banks and become identity providers in due course?
The way I look at so you alluded to open banking and open ID. So I'll reserve my comments on the just to the extent of open banking. So there, I think it's a wonderful tool. As part of ING, we have also actively encouraged open banking for multiple use cases. One of which is also on identity. So I refer to zero knowledge proof, those kinds of testing and validation exercises that we are doing. So of course it holds a strong potential and we want to develop it, but it is also a part of an ecosystem. Banks cannot do it alone. They need an active collaboration from other entities in the ecosystem to build together. And then it goes to the business models of relying parties, how they interchange information with you, etc. But that's a longest discussion. But yeah, overall, I think open banking is a positive step.
No, brilliant. And Karen, from your perspective, is more with the regulator's hat on, is I don't know how close you are to open banking. You refer to the EBA, etc. There, is that something that you see as a vital step towards identity?
As the other panelists mentioned, open banking was something that was ahead of its time, and yes, so we do see it as a means to allow both access and control of information. So I suppose in terms of how banks are placed to play a role in closing the identity gap with open banking and other tools, I suppose they are, going to be a big part of this digital solution and where we eventually land on digital identity. But I suppose it's not important. It's important to not to overstate the role of banks and to fall into the trap of seeing a predictable future based on the familiar past. We think that fintech firms will also be part of the solution, and that is based on their ability to develop products over shorter timeframes than the traditional incumbents. In many ways, the interesting debate will be how the established firms that carry the regulatory overhead engage with the smaller firms that are more agile because they have different cultures based on different compliance requirements.
And so just sticking with you for a moment on that, referring to compliance requirement, Horst talked earlier about, there could be a number of different winners in here, of which banks have some clear advantages, but not all of that really needs government and therefore, I guess, regulatory support. What kind of things do governments, regulators need to put in place to make digital identity a success? Whether that be banks or others? What are the key things that you see that the regulator would need to intervene in, if you like, and ensure they're done correctly?
Well, I think I mentioned earlier the EU strategy, digital finance strategy, talks about digital identity at length, and there is a proposal that by 2024 that there would be a framework in place to allow an interoperable digital identity. And I think this is going to require the combined effort of all of the players in this field, from the incumbents, as I mentioned earlier, banks, fintechs, perhaps the tech firms that are going to provide the digital plumbing, the European regulatory authorities, and the policymakers themselves to make sure that this is something that's usable and provides and facilitates innovation, but at the same time addressing consumer risk and allows consumers to have control over their data.
And is that specifically around enabling a user to use a digital ID within finance to prove themselves who they are from one finance provider to another, or is that broader than finance? Is it enabling them to use the ID in a broader context?
Well, I think that's quite a timely question, Nick, because I think last week as well, the European Commission issued a communication called the Digital Compass. And I think that talked about perhaps broadening out the debate from just financial services into the wider topic of accessing all types of services online. And in that communication, they mentioned that the need to review the EIDAS regulation, sorry, EIADS regulation, the use of electronic signatures, broadening it out from using it in the context of public services and using this in the context of private companies as well. So to answer your question, yes, this is an issue I think that is broader than finance and probably will be expanded out into the broader method of accessing services in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. And that EIDAS consultation, I believe, is well, some news from the EIDAS team is expected in April, I believe, as to that private sector engagement and what might happen next. So keen to see what the thinking is there. There is asked that in terms of taking to moving into looking at other use cases and where digital IDs would be useful. So Rod, where do you see the key use cases for digital might be outside of?
It's interesting, if I may, just for a second, to touch on your earlier question about regulation. I think the regulation is critical, and valuing people's privacy, asking institutions to respect that is critical. The one thing about banks today is that regulators know that we show up when they ask us to. We listen to them when they ask us to. We see the value in that regulation. We see strength in adhering to it, which is we see a benefit from it, which is not always the same for new tech companies. They don't necessarily take that approach, and that's our advantage in the market. To answer your question about where we can use this, I think it's every time you have a vacation rental or a job application, or you're signing up for a new dating profile or whatever, you can quickly prove your identity in a very simple way and not have to share overt information. Simple things like people proving that they're old enough to buy alcohol or to buy a lotto ticket without surrendering all of their private information. In many of these cases, it's just simply a yes or a no. Is this person eligible to consume this product if there's regulations around it, or is this person going to be a good risk to admit to the hotel? All the basic background checks that we have to do today when you check into a hotel. Problem is that as soon as you do that, the hotel is now in the business of maintaining all the safety and security around protecting your information. They get hacked sometimes. Your banks don't often get hacked. That's the idea, is to protect it in an institution that has the resources and the focus to actually protect your privacy.
So I think there's a number of issues on one of the second points we got on our overall agenda in terms of why are banks particularly suitable to take a role in this area, and perhaps in their way why some people are not as suitable. I mean, harsh on that particular area. Is anything from your perspective that makes banks suitable, or building on the case why others are not as suitable as banks? I'll take it either way.
So that, like I said, it's a tricky question to answer, why banks are suitable or not, and it completely depends on a geography question, ambition questions. For if we were to comment upon one particular bank or a group of banks in a particular country, I think alluding to the use cases referred to by Rod earlier, the way we see it is, there are a lot of use cases based on identity which can be created, which is transitioning from a pure paper approach. So just transforming a typical onboarding process in a more seamless way, using the identity solutions prevalent in the market. But there are also another set of highly efficient identity business models which can come up on top of it once the transition of standard traditional process materialize there. And therefore, why banks would be important here, apart from the trust part, is also they are fairly well entrenched into the market, right? So they can bring these different parties together who can benefit from such an infrastructure. So that's how I see it. But like I said, there's no straight answer, and it depends upon geography also. For example, just to clarify things further here, if there's a particular geography which is fragmented, right, and there's lots of banks in a particular geography, nobody holds a particular or a dominant position, then it is difficult to imagine that a few banks would be able to create that infra.
Indeed, and that's why I think we're seeing different solutions in different parts of the world, aren't we? And and in some part of the world, we've got telco taking the lead. I think as you suggested earlier on, and in some cases in partnership with banks. So Bjorn, from your perspective, is there anything else that makes a bank particularly suitable as a digital identity provider?
Well, there's obviously regulatory mandates that you establish an identity of a customer before you open an account for financial rules and anti-money laundering requirements, etc. But I'd say that the fact that much of today's digital activities are done on a mobile device, it's hard to ignore the role of the mobile network operator. And similar to banks, mobile network operators are also regulated. So there is a trust part to operators as well as with banks, that there isn't an incentive to violate privacy and selling the data. I'd say too, again, I reiterate that I think there will be an ecosystem, and depending on the use case, different roles may have a greater emphasis in supporting digital identity. And so I think it's hard to say banks or no banks. I think it's depending on region, it's depending on the use case. So I add this too in terms of the regulatory environment. I think there is a need to have more of a digital identity regulations and focus on what a digital identity is, similar to how you establish a natural identity, and that there are sources or of attributes that may contribute to validate parts of that identity depending on what the use case is. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that will be different depending on different sectors, won't it? Indeed. But I think to what you're picking up on there is the need for some kind of regulation, legislation, some rules, as you said earlier, that would ensure that the digital identity is delivered properly and that the user is properly supported. So at OAX, we refer to that as a framework that is, the vital collection of rules, policies, procedures, standards that come together to solve that particular problem. So I think let's just talk a little bit about what goes in one of those frameworks and what we think is vital. I mean, Karen, from your perspective, you're coming from a regulatory perspective. What are the really important rules that you think should be in place for digital identity to be successful?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think that it's important that the rules strike the right balance between facilitating innovation and at the same time managing risk, as some of the other panelists talked about this morning. The concept of trust and not oversharing private data. And I think what's really important is that there is that citizens feel that they can control their data, and that by signing up to any type of service, that they are not releasing all of their personal data to the entire world over the internet. So I think the concept of consent is going to be very key in the regulatory framework.
Brilliant, absolutely. So it's very much a user-centric approach in terms of making sure they're in the driving seat and understand
Absolutely.
where the information is going, and controlling what happens. So
If I may add,
yes, please.
so, sorry, Nick, but yeah, I just adding on to the fact that how can people or how can entities get together? I'd add another element to it. Why they need to get together is because we are seeing a lot of other identity solutions coming out in the market, which are in which user is given a convenience or better user experience, right? But in return, biometric data are being captured by entities, right? These biometric data needs to be treated very carefully, and therefore, I believe that there should be a close partnership between facilitated by the governments or the regulatory authorities and all entities in the ecosystem, including banks, telcos, etc., so that we offer a solution which is suited for our citizens. For example, under GDPR, biometric data is classified as a sensitive data, right? And therefore, the infra needs to be created that our citizens are not lured to store biometrics in other places which can be a potential risk later on, because once you have lost those data points, then yeah, it's only one time in a life that you have a biometric, right? So you cannot alter that. You cannot change the password there.
No, absolutely. And that's a challenge in itself in terms of credential reset. Rod, from your perspective, what's in terms of people coming together to solve this problem and the rules that are required, what's vital?
I think Karen hit upon the key thing of user-centric control. People should consciously be aware of when and how they're moving data. I should be aware of how my data is being moved, not because of clause 53B of some very long contract that I haven't seen, but that I am actually consciously approving how it's being moved right now. And I think that Harsh was brought up the key issue. I don't know how many folks have seen the recent joke things going around with a fake Tom Cruise or some other person where deep fake has absolutely completely captured an individual. Our biometrics, we only have one chance to use them. And if that gets to be something where we're forced to share them again and again and again, our security is going to be very compromised. From our perspective as an institution, I think though that there's a third layer to this, which is how the various sources of data interact. And I'm not sure clearly how to work with it. But for example, as a bank, when I try to verify that you're logging in and it's really you, I need to rely on information from the network mobile operator. I need to rely on your biometrics. I need to rely on government information about your identity, and I need to keep all of that safe. And that I need to assemble in order to be able to do it. So it's taking all of those data points, which means that I need some kind of a framework, some kind of a trusted system so that I can rely upon all of those. And also so I don't turn around and release it in some dangerous way to the safety of our customers.
Brilliant. So then the need there for that trust framework, across the ecosystem being online. Bjorn, from your perspective, what's vital in terms of rules and collaboration to make this a success?
Again, I agree with the majority of the comments that are already being made. I think what we've been emphasizing is having the technical framework to enable interoperability, whether that is the way you authenticate a user, the way you verify attributes. But as I mentioned before too, I'm a big believer in trust frameworks. They're not easy to set up, but they're very efficient once they're in place. Rather than having one contract, you have a framework, everybody buys into it. You can use the For those not familiar with trust framework, you can use the Visa network or the MasterCard network as an example for what it means to have a trust framework. Everybody has a defined role. Everybody knows the rules and are accountable for those rules of engagement. And so I think trust frameworks are hard to set up, but very efficient ones in place. And so that's a way to create an ecosystem as well in terms of the rules of engagement.
Yeah, brilliant, absolutely, and as you might expect, I completely agree with that. If people want to know more about what goes into a trust framework, then have a look at the Open Identity Exchange website, and we've got some guides on there as to what a trust framework is and what its content should be and how you should create and manage.
I think Open Identity Exchange has done a great job in terms of defining and giving examples of trust frameworks. I think you will see that too in the way we deal with either health passports for travel, etc. That there will be a trust framework for how you safely travel around. And I think the Open Identity Exchange has done some work in that area too. So.
Yes, and that's a very topical area. And we've only got a few minutes left now, so I was just going to ask each of you a final question as to, if you had a digital ID, where would you most want to use it? What do you think the most useful use case would be for you in terms of using an ID? So, Karen, over to you. Where would you use your digital ID?
Well, I think this is purely a personal view, of course, that what would be most useful for me as a personal consumer would be if I had a digital identity that I could use to access both public services and private services. As I say, this is just my purely personal opinion, but I think that would be quite an innovation. It would be very efficient. Obviously the ID would have to be very secure and not open to exposing myself to further risk of unauthorized use or access to my data. But I suppose in theory that could be the dream if we could build a framework that would allow me to have a digital identity that I could use to both apply for child benefit, for instance, and at the same time open up a new type of financial services account, and also could allow me to open a pension. So that's just a personal view, Nick. I don't know what the others.
Well, no, that's brilliant. I think what you're drawing out there is interoperability. You want an ID that works in lots of different areas, but just finishing around the team. So Harsh, where's your golden ticket with your digital ID? Where's that you?
Yeah, I'll provide a slightly different take on the question. So let me speak on behalf of a persona who's illiterate, who doesn't know how to log in his email address or type in the password. He doesn't know English, right? And then as that person, I would want a digital ID so that I can access all government benefit schemes. I can roll on, identify myself with just my biometrics, with no need or no inhibitions for me to be financially included or to avail of what other normal educated people can avail of. So that is my that's the boon that I see in terms of digital ID.
Brilliant. So inclusion. So whatever we do with digital ID has got to be inclusive, hasn't it? Bjorn, from your perspective, where's your digital ID dream use case?
I'm not sure there's a use case. I think it's attributes of a digital identity. I think a digital identity should be convenient to use, similar to how you can use your phone to pay for things. You have something that you can prove using something that is convenient, such as the mobile phone. I also think that sometimes you need to prove something that may not necessarily mean that the service provider needs to know everything about you. If they just need to know that you're over 18 and enable that digital identity to prove I'm over 18 without having to convey everything else about myself. I think that's another attribute of a digital identity that I think will make people at ease with using it, and also enable adoption.
Brilliant. So data minimization there as well, key principle. Thank you. And Rod, finally, just quick to you, where would you want to use your digital ID?
I'd want to use it everywhere around the world, maybe to travel. Again, when we can do that. So global.
Yeah. Global, absolutely. Brilliant. Well, thank you, everybody, for insight. So yeah, that's a brilliant session, and in the end, at the end, there's drawing out key concepts: interoperability, inclusion, absolutely key. Global usage. We want to see identities being used anywhere, all over the world, in a trusted manner. So, thank you to panelists today, Rod, Karen, Harsh, Bjorn. Thank you very much for your time, and thank you all for watching us. And I hope that's been a really useful session. But for us from now, we need to close. And if you have a Q&A, I think you'll be able to kind of hang around and put those in the chat, and we'll get back to you. But thank you, everybody on the panel, and thank you all for watching today.
Thank you for your moderation. Highly appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you.